Okay, good morning everyone. For today's brief lecture, I want to review a couple of the things that we have covered in previous Socrative quizzes. One of those is how you can move a person in an image, such as this lady standing on the beach, closer to a crowd if you were taking a group photo, or if you had a group photo where there was kind of somebody who was an outlier. So one of the ways is to actually use the Content Aware Move tool, which if you look down your tools here, you'll see the Spot Healing Brush, Patch tool, Red Eye tool, and Content Aware Move tool. And the way it works is you draw a little circle around the person you want to move, and then you drag them closer to the group, and once you hit the check mark up here, it makes their original spot disappear where they were and samples the water that was around them or the whatever's in the background. And then on the other side where you move them to, it moves them closer and it samples around a little bit and blends it in. In this case, it actually, you can see a faint outline, so you might want to use a different tool. In addition to that, like you could use the healing brush to go along the edges there and make the edge blend in a little bit more. Plus you see her reflection down here still, which again you could use the clone stamp or healing brush or spot healing brush on that area as well. Okay, so color modes. When you're dealing with color modes, remember image mode. There's RGB and CMYK are the ones you use the most. RGB is for stuff that's on the screen. CMYK is for stuff that's printed. So when you're creating a graphic for on-screen use, you tend to use RGB more. If you are creating something that's going to be printed, you would want to focus on CMYK. And with RGB, you have access to everything in Photoshop. You get more options than you do with CMYK, and that's because when you're using the screen itself as your way of viewing what you're working on, you will be able to do a little bit more with that, and you have a little bit less limitation. Whereas when you're moving from screen to print, you're using CMYK to simulate what it's going to look like. It's not going to be able to give you quite as rich effect as you would in this case. RGB is known as an additive color mode, where you mix colors, you add a color to another color, and it creates the other colors. So you have primary colors, red and green and blue, and if you mix red with blue, you get magenta. So when you're mixing the colors in RGB, you are using an additive method, whereas you're using subtractive when you're using CMYK. That may be something you'll encounter. Also, rule of thirds, just to review. Rule of thirds, you are using 2 vertical and 2 horizontal lines to determine how you are dividing up your screen. You're using it to create 9 equal sections, so 2 horizontal, 2 vertical. And what this is useful for is creating visual interest in your image. So in this case, if I don't want everything to be perfectly centered. If I have it off-centered, it tends to make you look a little bit longer at the image. So I'm having this little focal point of these people closer to this intersection, where you might use this guide as a horizon line to make this edge of the water line up with that. But in any case, it's not perfectly centered, so it makes your eye look in a different place than where you would expect. Just something that might help you on the geometrics is knowing how to use the straighten tool. We never really covered this so much, but the straighten tool is an option under crop tool. And the way it works is you choose the crop tool, it's this one right here. Go up to the top to the options, and you'll see straighten the image by drawing a line on it. And if I click that little thing next to straighten, and I go along this little shoreline back here, it'll go ahead and rotate it and make it flat. So now if I double click it or click the check mark, There it is, and I can move my image so that it is lined up with that top third there. So now I'm using rule of thirds within this image by having this little edge of the land over here intersect with that top third. So rule of thirds, straighten tool. Next thing, if you have a client who suggests an unattractive color scheme, by now, you've had this question a few times, you should know that you need to speak to the client about color choices, inform them, educate them, let them know that red is not necessarily going to go great with green. They're opposite intensity, they might be a little overpowering when you're using one on the other, and blue might not be good with black, especially dark blue. So you might talk to them about color schemes, you might present them with alternatives. Alright, so next thing I want to do is just review with you the FX and the new layers, how to create new layers, layer groups, and etc. And so what I've done is I've created a text layer here called Beach. And if I select it and go to FX, I have access to bevel and emboss, stroke, inner shadow, etc. So if I want to add a bevel, I can do that. And I can adjust it in here. I can also add a stroke, which it's going to be hard to see, but there's my stroke, and I can make it outside, inside, etc. You can also make your stroke transparent, so you can make it kind of like it looks like glass. You can also do an inner shadow, an outer shadow. I'm going to do a drop shadow. That's what I meant by outer shadow. Drop shadow, and it looks like it's kind of coming up off the screen. It gives you that effect. And so there's that. So that's the FX. There's other things on there which you can investigate. Click OK on that. I also want to talk about creating new layers. To create a new layer, anytime you see this icon on any of the panels, it means new. So if it's the layers panel, it's new layer. If it is the paths panel, it's going to be a new path. If it's an adjustment, if it's a style, Windows Styles, then you can create a new style. And so what I just did here with the FX, if I click this, I can call it Cool Bevel and Drop Shadow, and click OK, and now I have that new style in here. And one thing you'll see when you're working in geometrics, you might have something where it's going to ask you to apply a style. So if you have the styles panel and you hover over it, over each of these styles, you will eventually find the thing you're looking for. So if I'm looking for this one, which is, what do they call it, blue glass button, that's how you will get that. If I want chiseled sky, or if I want chromed satin, I can click any of these and it automatically changes to that style. So that's another cool thing for you to know. Also, so we got new, we talked about styles and grouping. If you want to group multiple layers together, it's more for organization than anything. You just hold down select while you're clicking the other one and click the folder. And then you get a group, and you can rename it, which you'll need to know how to do, by double clicking in that little place where the label is, and I can call it, I'll just call it blah. And then hit enter, and boom, I got a layer group. So that's that. I also want to talk about the view menu. So if you go into view, there are a few options here. If you don't have your rulers on, first of all, this is how you turn your rulers on. And there's also a thing in here that says snap to. And this is actually, I think it's by default it has everything checked, which means if I bring something in, if I make a shape, for instance, I'm going to make a rectangle, and I kind of move it around on here, you'll notice as you're kind of dragging it along one of these guides, it kind of snaps to it. It automatically kind of gets attached to it. So you can line things up perfectly that way if you wanted things to line up on a guide. You can also use it with grids. So if I go View, Show, Grid, now I have my grid up here. I can move it around and you'll notice it'll kind of snap to like the main lines on the grid. So that's what Snap to is, and it's available in the View menu. So if you want to snap the guides, you want to snap the grid, any of those things, it's View, Snap to. And you can uncheck Snap, and you can choose what you have it snap to. Alright, another thing I want to mention is camera raw format. Camera raw is what happens when you take a picture and it gets into your camera, but it is the original data that you have unprocessed, uncompressed. Happens when you are working with JPEG, or like when you create a JPEG, is you're compressing the file, and the way you compress it, you can imagine taking a book and any mention of the word the, THE, or and, you replace it with a single letter because it's something that's common. You can decrease the file size a whole lot. So what happens in a JPEG is it looks for redundant, repeating data that might create some sort of pattern, and it allows you to replace it with a single symbol, which decreases the file size. So that's how compression works, and a camera raw is unprocessed. It's uncooked. Think about raw meat and how it's uncooked. In the case of a camera raw, it's the raw image. It is the original data that is captured by the camera. Alright, next thing I want to do is talk about how you can select. Let me take off the grid. How you can select an area all with a single click. And remember, that magic wand tool allows you to go into a space that is all one color. So I'm selecting all the adjacent pixels of the same color with one click. And in this case, my tolerance is a little low, so if I hold down Shift, I can select more than one area. The reason it wouldn't select everything is because the sky is multiple shades of blue. So that's how that works. And then last thing I want to say is I want to talk about what pixels and resolution and vector. I want to kind of go over a few other terms that I haven't talked about. So a bitmap is any image where it is created using something that the file usually explains, or it has information that says where each pixel goes and what color it is. So it maps out each bit of the image. Vector, on the other hand, is where you have mathematically drawn lines and curves, and everything is done through mathematical equations, which allows you to resize and scale things without losing quality. Whereas with a bitmap, when you make it big, the pixels, you can't just imagine what pixels should go in there. The computer doesn't know how to calculate that, and so it just makes things blurry. So you'll think back to the fly exercise. When you took the small fly that wasn't a smart object and made it big, after making it really tiny, it became a little bit blurry and pixelated. So when you're dealing with resolution, when things are pixelated, it usually means that it was probably low resolution to start with. There weren't a lot of pixels per inch, and so when you blew it up, it got blurry. If you have high resolution images, they automatically have a lot more pixels within a small amount of space. So when you're talking about resolution, you're talking about what the image's size is by the number of dots that make up the image. So the number of dots within an inch. And normally with on-screen stuff, you go with a lower resolution, like 72. dots per inch, pixels per inch, and when you're dealing with printing, you're usually going something bigger because you want it to be very detailed. The reason you do it smaller on screen is so that it can transfer fast, so the data can move from one place to another. It's better for the internet when you're trying to download an image if it's a smaller file size, so smaller resolutions used on screen unless you're dealing with HD. Alright, so individual dots, of course, that make up an image are pixels, and so that's pretty much everything that I want to cover for our third Socrative quiz. Have a good rest of your day.